The fastest way to discover who respects you is to remove the one thing they admire. Michael Harrison had heard that sentence years ago during a leadership conference in Chicago. At the time, he dismissed it as clever nonsense. People respected success. People respected achievement. People respected power. At least that was what he believed. Then everything changed. 3 months earlier, Michael had been one of the most recognizable chief executive officers in America. Financial magazines printed his photograph on their covers. Television hosts asked for interviews. Investors followed his every move. His company employed thousands of people across the country. Then came the collapse. A chain of disastrous business decisions, market panic, and public criticism erased decades of success faster than anyone thought possible. Headlines called it one of the biggest corporate failures of the year. News programs discussed his mistakes for weeks. Social media turned him into a symbol of arrogance and failure. For a while, Michael stayed inside his penthouse overlooking Manhattan. He watched reporters speculate about his future. He watched former colleagues distance themselves. He watched invitations disappear. Some people expressed sympathy. Most simply moved on. One rainy morning, Michael stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment and realized something unsettling. Nobody called anymore. Not the executives who once praised him. Not the investors who once chased his attention. Not the people who insisted they were lifelong friends. The silence felt louder than any criticism. A week later, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He packed a single duffel bag. He left behind his luxury watches, expensive suits, and private transportation. He withdrew enough cash for basic expenses and rented an aging sedan. Then he disappeared. No announcements. No interviews. No explanations. Michael drove nearly 800 miles west until skyscrapers gave way to open roads and small towns. Eventually, he arrived in a quiet community where nobody recognized his face. The town sat between rolling hills and farmland. A single main street stretched through. The center. Local businesses occupied brick buildings that had stood for decades. It was the kind of place where people waved at strangers. Or at least that was what Michael expected. The first few days challenged that assumption. Wearing worn jeans and an old jacket, he visited diners, grocery stores, and coffee shops. He quickly noticed something. People looked past him. Store clerks greeted customers standing behind him before acknowledging his presence. Conversations ended when he approached. Smiles disappeared. Nobody was cruel. They simply acted as though he did not matter. Each small moment felt insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a painful pattern. For the first time in his adult life, Michael experienced what it felt like to be invisible. Late one afternoon, light rain began falling as he walked down Main Street. His jacket offered little protection. Cold wind pushed against him. Across the street, he noticed a modest restaurant glowing warmly through fogged windows. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the weather. Michael hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. He had no idea that the woman working behind the counter was about to change everything he believed about wealth, respect, and the true value of a human being. The bell above the restaurant door gave a soft chime as Michael stepped inside. Warm air immediately replaced the cold rain that clung to his jacket. The smell of fresh coffee, grilled sandwiches, and homemade pie filled the room. For a moment, he simply stood there. The restaurant was not fancy. The tables did not match perfectly. The floor showed signs of years of use. Yet the place felt alive in a way many luxury restaurants never did. Conversations drifted through the room. Local families shared meals. Truck drivers sat near the counter drinking coffee. An elderly couple occupied a corner booth, speaking quietly to one another. Michael chose an empty table near the window and sat down. Nobody paid much attention to him. He had already grown accustomed to that. A young server walked past carrying plates toward another table. 2 customers entered behind him and immediately received warm greetings from people. Inside, Michael watched quietly. 10 minutes passed before anyone approached his table. He was not offended. He was observing. That was why he came. Then he noticed her. A young waitress wearing a simple apron emerged from behind the counter carrying a coffee pot. Her pace was steady despite the busy dining room. She smiled at a customer, helped another carry a tray, and somehow remembered the name of a man who had just walked through the door. There was nothing dramatic about her. Nothing designed to attract attention. Yet Michael found himself watching because she seemed genuinely present with every person she met. Eventually, she reached his table. "Good afternoon," she said with a warm smile. "You look like you picked the worst possible day for a walk." Michael almost laughed. It was the first sincere sentence directed toward him all week. "I'm starting to think you might be right." "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She poured a fresh cup and placed a menu in front of him. "Take your time. My name is Emma if you need anything." Then she moved on to help another customer. Michael glanced around the room. The interaction had lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet something felt different. Emma had not looked at his worn jacket. She had not studied his appearance before deciding how much attention he deserved. She simply treated him like a person. 20 minutes later, she returned with his order. "First time in town?" she asked. Michael nodded. "Is it that obvious?" Emma smiled. "Small towns notice new faces." "And what is the verdict?" Michael asked. "Too early to tell," she replied playfully. "Come back a few times, and we will decide." Michael found himself smiling. After she left, he stared out the rain-covered window. For the first time in months, he was not thinking about stock prices, news headlines, or public humiliation. He was thinking about a waitress who treated strangers with the same respect she gave everyone else. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, something unexpected had begun. Michael did not know it yet, but the simple conversation he had just experienced would become the first step toward changing everything he believed about money, status, and the true measure of a person's worth. Michael returned the next day, then the day after that. By the end of the week, the small restaurant had quietly become part of his routine. Every afternoon, he parked his aging sedan across the street, walked through the front door, and chose the same table near the window. Outside, life moved at the comfortable pace of a small town. Inside, he continued an experiment nobody knew existed. He watched how people interacted when money, status, and reputation were removed from the equation. The results were not encouraging. A man at a hardware store spoke to him with impatience after assuming he could not afford certain supplies. A customer at a gas station stepped ahead of him in line without apology. Even simple conversations often ended the moment people decided he had nothing useful to offer. None of these moments were dramatic. Yet together they revealed something Michael had never fully understood. Success attracted attention. Failure revealed character. Every afternoon, however, one exception waited inside the restaurant. Emma greeted him exactly the same way each time he arrived. "Good afternoon, Michael." Not sir. Not boss. Not mister. Simply Michael. She remembered his coffee order after 2 visits. She asked about his day and actually listened to the answer. More surprisingly, she treated every customer with equal care. Michael began noticing details. An elderly farmer who spent only a few dollars received the same smile as a local business owner ordering a large meal. A teenager studying alone after school received free refills without needing to ask. A delivery driver rushing through lunch was greeted by name. Emma never appeared to calculate a person's value before deciding how much kindness they deserved. One rainy afternoon, Michael watched her help an older customer gather papers that had fallen from a briefcase. The customer barely acknowledged her effort before returning to a phone call. Emma simply smiled and walked away. No frustration. No complaint. Later, when the restaurant grew quiet, Michael found himself asking a question. "Does that ever bother you?" Emma looked up from wiping a table. "What?" "People who take kindness for granted." She thought for a moment. "Sometimes." Michael waited. "Then why keep doing it?" Emma placed the cloth down and smiled softly. "Because their behavior says something about them. Mine says something about me." The answer lingered in Michael's mind long after she returned to work. Years earlier, he might have dismissed the statement as idealistic. Now it felt unexpectedly profound. Over the following days, their conversations gradually grew longer. Nothing dramatic. Weather, local events, favorite books, childhood memories. Michael was careful never to reveal his past. Emma never pushed for answers. She seemed comfortable allowing people to share only what they wished to share. One afternoon, she noticed him staring out the window during a thunderstorm. "You missed something," she said quietly. Michael glanced toward her. "What makes you think that?" Emma nodded toward the rain. "People only stare at storms like that when they are thinking about someplace else." Michael looked back outside. For a moment, he considered changing the subject. Instead, he offered a rare truth. "I miss who I used to be." Emma studied him carefully. Then she surprised him again. "Maybe." She refilled his coffee cup. "Or maybe you miss who you thought you were." The words landed harder than she realized. Because for the first time since his downfall, Michael wondered whether losing everything had not destroyed his identity. Maybe it was revealing it. The following week brought clear skies and colder mornings. Michael continued returning to the restaurant every afternoon, always choosing the same table near the window. By now, some of the regular customers recognized him, not as anyone important, simply as the quiet man who drank coffee and watched the world pass by. Surprisingly, he preferred it that way. One Tuesday afternoon, the restaurant was unusually busy. A local charity event had filled nearly every table. Servers moved quickly between customers. Orders piled up. Conversations blended into a steady hum of voices. Michael sat quietly reading an old newspaper when he noticed something happening near the front counter. A well-dressed businessman had become frustrated after waiting several minutes for his order. His impatience grew with every passing second. Michael watched as Emma approached with a sincere apology and an offer to make things right. Instead of calming down, the man became more dismissive. He spoke to her as though she were invisible, as though her effort carried no value. Michael felt a familiar discomfort. Years ago, he had attended meetings where people treated service workers the same way. At the time, he rarely intervened. He told himself it was not his responsibility. Now, sitting alone in a small-town restaurant, the behavior looked completely different. Emma remained calm. She listened. She apologized again, even though the delay was not her fault. She resolved the problem and wished the customer a pleasant afternoon. Minutes later, she returned to Michael's table carrying fresh coffee. "Busy day," he said. Emma laughed softly. "That is one way to describe it." Michael glanced toward the departing businessman. "You handled that well." Emma followed his gaze. "Everyone has difficult days." "That sounds generous." "Maybe." She smiled. "Or maybe people reveal more about themselves when things do not go their way." The sentence reminded Michael of countless boardrooms, negotiations, and corporate events from his former life. How many times had he measured people by performance instead of character? How many times had he mistaken confidence for integrity? The questions lingered throughout the afternoon. Later, as the crowd began thinning, Michael noticed Emma sitting briefly at a side table reviewing paperwork. College brochures rested beside a notebook. Before she noticed him looking, she quickly gathered everything and placed it back inside her bag. The movement was small, but it caught his attention. A few minutes later, while refilling his coffee, she noticed his curious expression. "What?" she asked with a smile. Michael hesitated. "Nothing important." "That usually means it is important." He laughed quietly. "I saw the brochures." For a moment, Emma looked embarrassed. Then she nodded. "Old plans. For college." She shrugged. "Something like that." Michael sensed there was more to the story, but he did not push. Instead, he watched her return to work. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long golden reflections across empty tables. For reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself wondering about her future. Not because she needed rescuing. Not because she asked for help. Simply because she seemed like someone who carried unrealized potential with remarkable grace. And as Michael stared into his coffee cup, a new idea quietly formed in his mind. If people truly revealed themselves when they had little, perhaps character was also revealed when temptation appeared. For the first time since arriving in town, he began considering a test. Not for the world. Not for strangers. For the one person who had never treated him differently from anyone else. For 2 days, Michael wrestled with the idea. Every time he entered the restaurant and saw Emma moving between tables with quiet confidence, the question returned. Was her kindness truly unconditional, or had he simply not placed enough temptation in front of her? The thought bothered him more than he expected. Not because he doubted Emma, because he was beginning to hope she was exactly who she appeared to be. Late Friday afternoon, the restaurant was unusually calm. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A handful of customers occupied scattered tables, while gentle country music played through overhead speakers. Michael sat alone near the window watching droplets race down the glass. Across the room, Emma balanced receipts and prepared for the evening rush. He reached inside his jacket and touched a sealed envelope. Inside rested several $1,000s in cash. To Michael, the amount was insignificant. To many people, it represented months of income. The plan was simple. Leave the envelope behind. Make it appear accidental. Then wait. He hated himself a little for doing it. Yet curiosity pushed him forward. Years in business had taught him that character often revealed itself when nobody believed they were being observed. When Emma delivered his coffee, she noticed his unusual silence. "You look like someone trying to solve a difficult problem," she said. Michael smiled faintly. "Maybe I am. Good luck with that." She laughed and moved on to another table. The warmth in her voice made the envelope feel heavier. For a moment, he nearly abandoned the entire idea. Then he remembered the countless people who had changed the moment money entered the conversation. Friends, executives, investors, even family members. Wealth had a way of exposing motives hidden beneath polished appearances. An hour later, Michael stood to leave. He paid for his meal, thanked Emma, and walked out into the damp evening air. The envelope remained beneath the edge of the table, where it was visible enough to be found, but hidden enough to appear forgotten. Across the street, he climbed into his sedan and waited. Rain continued falling. Restaurant lights glowed warmly through the windows. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, he saw Emma cleaning the table. She noticed the envelope almost immediately. Michael leaned forward slightly. Emma picked it up and examined it. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. She looked around the room. She spoke briefly with another employee. Then she disappeared into the manager's office carrying the envelope. Michael expected that. What happened next surprised him. Nearly 30 minutes later, long after her shift ended, Emma emerged from the restaurant, still holding the envelope. Instead of leaving for home, she walked toward the parking lot, stopping beside several vehicles as though searching for someone. She spoke with customers, checked license plates, asked questions. The rain soaked her jacket, yet she continued looking. Michael watched silently from across the street. She was not trying to keep the money. She was trying to find its owner. Eventually, she stood beneath a street lamp, glanced at the envelope one final time, and sighed. Then she carefully placed it inside her bag and headed home. Not with excitement, not with triumph, with determination. And as Michael watched her disappear into the rainy evening, he suddenly had a feeling that the test he designed was about to teach him far more than it taught her. The next afternoon, Michael arrived earlier than usual. The sky was clear after 2 days of rain, and sunlight reflected off the storefront windows along Main Street. As he crossed the street toward the restaurant, he felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Part of him expected the envelope to be gone. Another part hoped it would not be. When he stepped inside, Emma was already working. She greeted him with the same warm smile she always offered. Nothing about her behavior seemed different. No excitement, no secret satisfaction, no sign that she had spent the previous evening holding more cash than many people in town saw in months. Michael took his usual seat near the window. A few minutes later, Emma approached carrying a coffee pot. "Good afternoon, Michael." "Good afternoon." She poured his coffee and hesitated. "Actually, I was hoping you would come in today." Michael kept his expression neutral. "Really?" Emma nodded and reached into her apron pocket. Then she placed the sealed envelope on the table between them. Michael looked down at it. The envelope was exactly as he had left it. "I think this belongs to you," she said. "You left it under the table yesterday." Michael glanced at the envelope before looking back at her. "You are certain?" Emma smiled softly. "You sat there for nearly 2 hours. Nobody else used that table afterward." Michael remained silent. Emma continued. "I tried finding you last night. I stayed almost an hour after work asking around. That sounds like a lot of effort." It seemed important. Michael rested a hand on the envelope. "Did you open it?" The question came out more directly than he intended. Emma shook her head immediately. "No, you never wondered what was inside." She laughed quietly. "Of course I wondered. But you did not look. It was not mine." The answer arrived so naturally that it almost startled him. No hesitation. No performance. Just a simple statement of principle. Michael looked out the window for a moment. Across the street, people moved through their ordinary routines. Cars passed. Shop owners swept sidewalks. Life continued. Yet inside the restaurant, something important had shifted. "Emma," he said carefully, "what if the person who lost it never came back?" She thought for a moment. "Then I would leave it with the manager and keep trying, even if nobody ever claimed it." "Especially then." Michael studied her face. "Why?" Emma leaned lightly against the table. "Because keeping something that does not belong to me would change how I see myself." The words settled over the conversation like sunlight. She was not talking about money. She was talking about identity, character, self-respect. Michael suddenly remembered executives who had justified dishonesty for profit, investors who abandoned principles for opportunity, friends who disappeared when circumstances changed. Yet this young waitress earning an hourly wage understood something many wealthy people never learned. Some things cost more than money. Emma pushed the envelope closer to him. Anyway, I'm glad you came back. Then she smiled. You looked worried enough yesterday that I figured whatever was inside must matter. She walked away before he could respond. Michael sat alone staring at the envelope. For the first time since beginning his experiment, he realized the lesson was no longer about whether Emma could pass a test. The real question was why he ever believed she needed one. After that afternoon, something subtle changed between them. Not in the way they spoke. Not in the way Emma greeted him each day. The change happened inside Michael. The experiment that had brought him to town was beginning to unravel. He had arrived believing that people could be measured through tests. Now he found himself questioning the person who designed them. The following week passed quietly. Autumn settled deeper across the valley. Trees along Main Street turned shades of gold and amber. The restaurant remained busy with regular customers, traveling workers, and families gathering after school and work. Michael continued taking his seat by the window. Emma continued treating him exactly as she treated everyone else. That consistency fascinated him more than anything. Most people adjusted their behavior depending on circumstances. Emma never seemed to. One afternoon, the restaurant grew unusually quiet between lunch and dinner. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across. Empty tables. Emma sat briefly at a nearby booth, organizing paperwork from her bag. This time she did not hide it when Michael noticed. College brochures, financial aid forms, course catalogs, the same documents he had glimpsed days earlier. Michael looked toward the stack. You have been carrying those around for a while. Emma smiled. You noticed? Hard not to. She glanced down at the papers before folding them neatly together. Old dream. Complicated timing. Michael stirred his coffee slowly. What did you want to study? Education. Her answer came immediately. I always thought I would become a teacher. Michael nodded. What happened? Emma laughed softly. Life happened. The answer was simple, but he sensed years behind it. For a moment, she seemed uncertain whether to continue. Then, perhaps because the restaurant was quiet, she decided to. My father got sick during my second year of community college. My mother was already working 2 jobs. Someone had to help. She shrugged gently. 1 semester turned into 2. 2 turned into 5 years. There was no bitterness in her voice. No self-pity. Only acceptance. Michael found that remarkable. Many people carried disappointments like accusations against the world. Emma carried hers with grace. Do you still want it? He asked. She looked toward the window where afternoon sunlight illuminated the street outside. Every day. The honesty of the answer hung in the air between them. Then why not go back? Emma smiled. Because wanting something and being ready for it are not always the same thing. Michael considered that. In boardrooms, he had spent years surrounded by ambitious people. Most wanted more. Few understood sacrifice. Emma had postponed her future to care for her family without demanding recognition for it. The realization deepened his respect. A customer entered through the front door, and Emma stood to return to work. Before leaving, she paused beside the table. Can I tell you something strange? Michael nodded. Most people think money solves every problem. She smiled thoughtfully. Sometimes it does. But the hardest decisions in life usually have nothing to do with money. Then she walked away. Michael watched her greet the customer with the same warmth she offered everyone else. For a long moment, he sat motionless beside the window. He had spent decades believing wealth created freedom. Yet the young waitress moving through the restaurant possessed something he had rarely encountered among executives, investors, or powerful leaders. She knew exactly who she was. And as the afternoon sunlight faded across Main Street, Michael began to realize that was worth more than any balance sheet he had ever owned. The conversation stayed with Michael long after he left the restaurant that evening. As he drove through the quiet streets of town, Emma's words repeated in his mind. The hardest decisions in life usually had nothing to do with money. For most of his career, he would have disagreed. Entire industries rose and fell because of money. Companies expanded because of money. Careers were built around money. Yet somehow a young waitress earning an ordinary paycheck seemed to understand something that had taken him nearly 60 years to learn. The next few days passed quietly. The restaurant remained busy. Autumn winds carried leaves across Main Street. Emma continued serving customers, remembering names, refilling coffee cups, and moving through each shift with the same calm presence. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was waiting for a rescue. She never mentioned college again. She never complained about circumstances. She simply kept working. One afternoon, Michael arrived to find the restaurant unusually crowded. Every table was occupied. He took his usual seat and watched the familiar rhythm unfold around him. Near the counter, two local customers were discussing rising tuition costs. The conversation drifted across the room. One of them laughed and said that education had become a luxury most people could no longer afford. The comment seemed harmless. Yet Michael noticed Emma glance down briefly before continuing her work. It lasted less than a second, but he saw it. For the first time, he recognized the hidden weight she carried. Later, when the lunch crowd finally eased, Emma brought him a fresh cup of coffee. "Long day, Michael?" asked. She smiled. "Nothing unusual." "You always say that." "Because most days are not unusual." Michael looked toward the window. "And the unusual ones?" Emma laughed softly. "Those are the days that become stories." Michael smiled. Then a thought occurred to him. What would your story be? Emma considered the question while adjusting the coffee pot in her hand. Honestly. She looked around the restaurant before answering. "I would finish what I started." Michael knew exactly what she meant. "College." She nodded. "Not because I need a different life. I like my life." The answer surprised him. "Then why?" Emma glanced toward a family seated near the back of the restaurant. A young girl sat doing homework while waiting for her mother to finish lunch. "Because I think helping people learn changes more than one person at a time." There was no grand speech, no dramatic declaration, just a simple conviction spoken with complete sincerity. Michael watched her walk away after that. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the window beside him. Across the street, ordinary life continued as it always had. Yet something inside him was changing. When he first arrived in town, he believed he was studying other people. Now he understood that every conversation with Emma was quietly exposing flaws in his own thinking. The test was over. The lesson was not. And as he sat alone beside the window, Michael began considering a possibility he had not allowed himself to entertain before. Perhaps it was finally time to stop hiding behind the life he had invented and tell Emma the truth about who he really was. For 3 days, Michael carried the truth without speaking it. Every afternoon he entered the restaurant, took his place by the window, and watched Emma move through the dining room with the same quiet confidence that had first caught his attention weeks earlier. The longer he waited, the more difficult the conversation seemed to become. It was not fear of being recognized. It was fear of changing something genuine. Until now, every interaction between them had been simple, honest, unaffected by titles, wealth, or reputation. Once the truth emerged, there would be no returning to that simplicity. Late Thursday afternoon, the restaurant sat in one of its rare, quiet moments. Only a handful of customers occupied the booths. Outside, a cool breeze carried fallen leaves down Main Street. Emma approached his table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "You look distracted today," she said. Michael smiled faintly. "Do I?" "A little." She poured coffee into his cup. "You have been staring at the same page of that newspaper for 10 minutes. Michael glanced down. She was right. He had not read a single word. Emma tilted her head slightly. "Something on your mind?" For a moment, he considered telling her everything. The rise of his company, the collapse, the headlines, the months of isolation, the experiment that brought him here. Instead, he asked a question. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If you discovered someone had not been completely honest about who they were, would it change how you saw them?" Emma thought carefully before answering. "That depends." "On what?" "Why they were not honest." Michael looked toward the window. "What if they were ashamed?" Emma remained quiet for a moment. "Then I would probably feel sorry for them." "Sorry, not because they made mistakes." She smiled gently. "Because carrying a secret is exhausting." The answer struck him harder than expected. She had no idea how accurate it was. Before he could respond, a customer called for assistance. Emma excused herself and walked away. Michael sat alone, reflecting on the conversation. The opportunity had appeared and disappeared in less than a minute. Yet her words lingered. Carrying a secret is exhausting. She was right. Over the following hour, he watched her interact with customers. Nothing about her behavior changed. She laughed with an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary. She helped a young mother carry drinks to a table. She remembered names, favorite meals, and small details most people overlooked. Michael suddenly realized something important. Emma's kindness was not selective. It was not a performance. It was a habit rooted deeply within her character. As evening approached, he folded his newspaper and prepared to leave. Emma stopped by his table one final time. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. Michael hesitated. Then he smiled. "Yes, tomorrow." But as he stepped outside into the cool autumn air, he made a decision. Tomorrow would not be another ordinary afternoon. Tomorrow he would stop hiding. Tomorrow the waitress who had treated him with dignity when she believed he had nothing would finally learn who had been sitting across from her all this time. And for the first time since arriving in town, Michael felt nervous about what would happen next. Michael barely slept that night. Long after the town had gone quiet, he sat alone inside the small rental house, staring at a business magazine he had purchased months earlier and never opened. His photograph remained on the cover. The headline described the rise and fall of a once celebrated executive. He studied the image for a long time. The man staring back seemed strangely unfamiliar. Confident, certain, untouchable. By morning, Michael had made peace with what needed to happen. The truth had waited long enough. When he arrived at the restaurant that afternoon, Emma greeted him as she always did. "Good afternoon, Michael." Her smile was warm and effortless. For a moment, he almost postponed the conversation again. Then he remembered why he came to town in the first place. The lunch crowd slowly thinned. Sunlight streamed through the front windows. Around 3 o'clock, the restaurant settled into one of its quiet periods. Michael folded his hands around a coffee cup and waited until Emma stopped beside his table. "You seem serious today," she said. "I probably am." Emma studied his face. "Everything okay?" Michael reached into his jacket and placed the magazine on the table. He turned it toward her. Emma glanced down casually at first. Then her expression changed. The color seemed to leave her face for a moment. Her eyes moved from the photograph to Michael and back again. Silence settled between them. "That is you," she said quietly. Michael nodded. Emma looked again, searching for some sign that she had misunderstood. There was none. "You are Michael Harrison." "Yes." She slowly sat down across from him. For the first time since they met, she appeared genuinely speechless. Several seconds passed before she finally spoke. "The company, the news, all of it, all of it." Emma looked down at the magazine once more. "I do not understand." Michael took a slow breath. "After everything collapsed, I wanted to disappear for a while. I wanted to see what remained when the title disappeared." Emma listened without interrupting. So Michael told her more. Not everything, but enough. The collapse, the isolation, the decision to leave, the small town, the experiment. He even admitted leaving the envelope intentionally. That confession earned the first reaction he had not expected. Emma laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a brief laugh of disbelief. "You tested me?" Michael winced. "I did. That was not very nice." "No, it was not." For a moment they sat quietly. Then something remarkable happened. Emma smiled. Not because she was impressed. Not because she suddenly viewed him differently. Simply because the truth was finally on the table. "You know what is strange?" she asked. Michael shook his head. "The whole time I thought you were hiding something." "You did?" "Of course." She smiled again. People do not stare out windows that much unless they are carrying a story. Michael found himself laughing. It was the first genuine laugh he had experienced in months. Then Emma pushed the magazine gently aside. "Well," she said, reaching for the coffee pot. "Now I know your full name." She refilled his cup exactly as she had done every day before. No ceremony, no special treatment, no sudden change. And as Michael watched her return to work, he realized the revelation he feared most had changed almost nothing at all, which somehow meant everything. The next morning, Michael expected something to change. He expected whispers, curious questions, awkward conversations. After all, the truth was no longer hidden. Yet when he walked into the restaurant that afternoon, the familiar bell above the door rang. Emma looked up from the counter, and everything felt surprisingly normal. "Good afternoon, Michael," she said with the same easy smile. Not Mr. Harrison, not CEO, just Michael. For a moment, he stood there, almost amused by the simplicity of it. He took his usual seat near the window. Outside, a steady autumn breeze carried leaves across Main Street. Inside, coffee cups clinked softly against saucers. Life continued. A few minutes later, Emma brought his coffee. "So," she said, setting the cup down, "how does it feel?" Michael looked up. "How does what feel?" being famous and anonymous at the same time. He laughed quietly. I'm not sure there is a guidebook for that. Emma smiled and sat briefly across from him during a slow moment. I looked up a few articles last night. Michael nodded. I assumed you might. Some of them were not very kind. Most of them were not. Emma studied him for a second. That must have been difficult. The response surprised him. Most people focused on the money, the business failure, the headlines. Emma seemed interested only in the human cost. Michael looked out the window before answering. Losing the company was painful. Losing the version of myself tied to it was worse. Emma nodded as though she understood. People are not supposed to be the same thing as their job. I know that now. The conversation ended when customers began arriving, but her words remained with him throughout the afternoon. Over the following days, something else became clear. Emma truly had not changed. She still challenged him when she disagreed. She still laughed at his occasional attempts to sound wiser than he felt. She still treated him exactly like every other customer who walked through the door. That consistency affected him more than admiration ever could. One evening, after most of the customers had left, Michael noticed Emma reviewing the same college paperwork again. The corners of the brochures were worn from being handled so often. This time he decided not to ignore it. You still keep those with you? Emma glanced down at the papers and smiled. I guess I do. Have you ever calculated exactly what it would take? She nodded. Many times. And Emma shrugged. Enough that it feels impossible some days. Not impossible forever. Just impossible right now. Michael leaned back in his chair. Months earlier, he would have immediately reached for a solution, written a check, solved the problem. That was how powerful people often approach difficulty. Yet Emma had already taught him that some gifts carried invisible costs. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. If the opportunity appeared tomorrow, would you take it? Emma looked toward the window where the last sunlight of the day painted the street gold. Her answer came without hesitation. Yes. There was no doubt. No uncertainty. Only quiet conviction. Michael smiled softly into his coffee. For the first time since arriving in town, he knew exactly what he wanted to do next. But unlike the tests and assumptions of his past, this decision would not be about proving anything. It would be about recognizing something that had been obvious from the very beginning. Emma did not need saving. She simply deserved a door that had remained unfairly closed for far too long. The following Monday arrived with bright skies and unusually warm weather for late autumn. Main Street was busy. Shop owners swept sidewalks. Customers moved in and out of local businesses. Inside the restaurant, the familiar rhythm of coffee cups, conversations, and laughter continued as though nothing had changed. Yet Michael carried a quiet sense of purpose he had not felt in a very long time. He arrived earlier than usual and chose his seat by the window. In front of him rested a simple folder. No dramatic presentation. No elaborate surprise. Just paperwork. When Emma greeted him, she immediately noticed the folder. That looks serious, she said. Michael smiled. Not serious. Important. Emma raised an eyebrow. That sounds worse. He laughed softly. Maybe sit down for a minute when you get a chance. Throughout the morning, Michael watched her move through the restaurant. The same patience. The same attention to people. The same dignity that had quietly transformed his understanding of success. For the first time, he realized how rare that combination truly was. Around mid-afternoon, the dining room finally became quiet enough for Emma to join him. She slid into the chair across from his table and glanced at the folder. Should I be worried? No, Michael pushed it gently toward her. Just open it. Emma looked uncertain, but complied. She opened the folder and began reading. Her expression changed almost immediately. First confusion, then disbelief, then complete silence. Michael watched as she slowly turned each page. University enrollment information, tuition coverage, housing assistance, academic support resources. Every detail carefully arranged. Emma looked up. Michael. He nodded. I spoke with some people. She stared at him. Some people? Old contacts. Emma looked back down at the documents. This cannot be real. It is. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. The restaurant seemed unusually quiet. Even the sounds from the kitchen faded into the background. Finally, Emma closed the folder and placed both hands on top of it. Why? The question was simple. Honest. Michael appreciated that. Because you earned the opportunity. Emma shook her head immediately. No, I did not. Michael smiled. That is exactly why you did. She looked away toward the window. Outside, sunlight reflected off parked cars and storefront glass. This feels like charity. Michael waited until she met his eyes again. If I believed that, I would not be offering it. Emma remained silent. You never asked me for anything, he continued. You never tried to impress me. You never changed when you learned who I was. You simply kept being yourself. The words settled between them. This is not a reward for kindness, Michael said. It is an investment in someone who already proved what she would do with an opportunity. Emma looked down at the folder again. Her eyes glistened slightly, but her voice remained steady. You really believe I can do this? Michael smiled. Emma, I think you have been doing difficult things for years. For the first time since opening the folder, she laughed quietly. Then she shook her head in disbelief. I do not even know what to say. Michael glanced toward the window where fallen leaves drifted across Main Street. You do not have to say anything today. Emma looked back at the paperwork, then at Michael, then back at the paperwork once more. And in that moment, he saw something he had not seen before. Not surprise, not gratitude, possibility. The kind that appears when a door long believed closed finally begins to open. Winter eventually gave way to spring. The trees along Main Street turned green again. Outdoor tables reappeared in front of cafes and shops. The town looked brighter, as though it had quietly decided to begin again. Much had changed over the previous months. Emma was now enrolled in classes she once believed would remain only a dream. Her days were longer than ever. Mornings were spent studying. Afternoons were spent at the restaurant. Evenings often disappeared beneath textbooks, lesson plans, and assignments. Yet whenever Michael saw her, he noticed the same thing. She looked tired sometimes, busy often, but she looked alive. One warm afternoon, Michael returned to the restaurant and found his usual table waiting beside the window. Some habits never changed. A few minutes later, Emma approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might be here today, she said. Michael smiled. You know me too well. Emma sat across from him during a quiet moment between customers. A stack of books rested beside her. Michael glanced at them. How is the future teacher doing? Emma laughed. Ask me again after finals. They shared a quiet moment as sunlight filled the room. Outside, people moved along Main Street. Inside, the familiar sounds of conversation and coffee cups created a comforting rhythm. For a while, neither spoke. There was no need. Some friendships reached a point where silence felt as natural as conversation. Eventually, Emma looked toward the window and smiled. Can I tell you something? Always. She folded her hands around her coffee cup. When you first walked in here, I thought you looked lonely. Michael laughed softly. That obvious? Very. He nodded. You were right. Emma studied him for a moment. You do not look lonely anymore. The observation lingered between them. Michael glanced around the restaurant. The place that had once been nothing more than a stop during an experiment had become something far more valuable. It had become a reminder that people could not be measured by bank accounts, job titles, or public reputation. A reminder that character revealed itself in small choices nobody applauded. A reminder that kindness remained powerful precisely because it was freely given. You know, Michael said, I came here thinking I had lost everything. Emma smiled. And Michael looked at the sunlight dancing across the window glass. Turns out I was carrying some things I needed to lose. Emma laughed quietly. That sounds like something from a very expensive leadership seminar. Probably. They both laughed. Then the front door opened and new customers entered. Emma stood and picked up her coffee cup. Before returning to work, she paused beside the table. Thank you, Michael. He looked up. For what? Emma smiled. For opening a door. Then she walked away. Michael watched her greet the new customers with the same warmth she had shown him on that rainy afternoon months ago. Nothing about her success had changed who she was. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. Michael had spent a lifetime measuring wealth in numbers. Sitting beside the restaurant window, watching a young woman build a future through dignity, effort, and character, he finally understood a different truth. The richest person at the table is rarely the one with the most money. It is the one who knows exactly who they are when money is removed from the equation.